Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Fetter, and I have the privilege of serving as the acting director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality and associate professor of religious studies and theology here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Before introducing our guest, I would like to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan, with support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross and the college, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. The format for our program this evening is threefold. First, author, Professor Hanlon Rubio will offer a brief presentation about her book, Can You Be a Catholic and a Feminist? Next, she and I will engage in conversation about the text, and finally, we will open the floor for questions and comments from our audience. So please feel free to send in your questions and comments at any time via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. So a tip, if you don't see that button, press the More button and then it might pop up. So now it is my privilege to introduce our guest today. Julie Hanlon Rubio is the Shea Hussman Professor of Christian Social Ethics at Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. Her research focuses on family, feminism, and politics. She is the author or editor of 7 books, including the award-winning Family Ethics, Practices for Christians, and Hope for Common Ground, mediating the personal and the political in a divided church, both published by Georgetown University Press. She and her colleague Paul Schutz were co-primary investigators for an interdisciplinary study on clericalism and clergy sexual abuse, Beyond Bad Apples. Her most recent book, Can You Be a Catholic and a Feminist?, was published by Oxford University Press in 2024. An Italian translation was recently released. In the fall of 25, she was a visiting scholar at the University of Central America in El Salvador, studying reconciliation and restorative justice for a new book project titled Family Repair. Welcome, Dr. Hanlon Rubio.
Thank you so much. And I kind of wish I was with you in South Bend, but also happy to be in my office in sunny Berkeley, California. So the book we're going to talk about tonight had its genesis at St. Louis University, where I taught for 19 years, and at the Jesuit School of Theology here in Berkeley, where I teach now. For nearly 2 decades at SLU, I taught a course called Sex, Gender, and Christian Ethics every spring to undergrads. That meant a lot of conversations with undergrads about hookup culture and same-sex marriage, gender, sexual violence, all the controversial things. Navigating those conversations with students and colleagues in the Department of Women and Gender Studies showed me just how acute the tension between feminism and Catholicism was becoming. And being here at JST, which is a graduate school of theology and ministry where priests and men preparing for priesthood, along with some sisters and lay people prepare for ministry in the Catholic Church, brought home to me the urgency of the question, can you be a Catholic and a feminist? At a university, even a Catholic university, you can keep the question kind of at a distance as you walk across campus and navigate different disciplines. But at a school like JST, my office, where I am now, is on the 3rd floor. My classroom is on the 2nd floor, and the chapel hosting 2 daily masses is on the 1st floor. And the beauty of the church is on full display right next to its profound limitations. And the question becomes unavoidable. Of course, the question has a history. Yet, though many books were written about it in the 1980s and 1990s, the question of the book's title has not received serious attention for a long time. And that is despite a lot of new challenges like the clergy sex abuse crisis, the fall of Roe v. Wade, COVID and declining mass attendance, new ideas about marriage and gender, and the prevalence of female leaders in other realms, which makes the Catholic Church's all-male clergy appear even more odd. I wrote this book because I sensed that more people, especially but not only women, were questioning the compatibility of Catholicism with feminism for different reasons. Some are frustrated at the slow pace of change and wonder if the Catholic Church still has room for feminists. Feminism is a part of who they are now, and Catholicism has come to feel like a place they visit rather than an identity they can claim as their own. Others are drawn to the depth of the Catholic tradition, but they worry that feminism doesn't really welcome Catholics. And I wanted to write a book for all of them. Not to give a one-size-fits-all answer, but to offer a range of possibilities and something for the journey for people who are seeking a place to reflect and discern. So tonight, I want to highlight 3 points that are central to the book's project of reconciling Catholicism and feminism, but are also, I hope, relevant to anyone who struggles with faith, identity, and belonging today. So point 1, the tensions are real. The book tackles the question, can you be a Catholic and feminist, as a question of identity. So it's not, can I believe this, but can I be this? Philosopher Charles Taylor has argued that authenticity in identity is something modern people value. It is important for us to be ourselves, to have a life of our own making, to be, in some sense, original. In that context, saying I'm Catholic is much harder for me than it was, say, for my Italian grandmother. The answer of earlier generations, my family is Catholic, so I am too, is no longer sufficient. The book's cover image, and I know it's on the poster too, is meant to capture the question and the tensions that lie underneath it. It's Mary at the Annunciation. She's looking perplexed as she ponders, how can this be? She is not triumphant nor humble. She has heard an invitation and she pauses with her hand like this, as if saying, hold on, I need to think about this. Some people are very conscious of the tensions that give rise to the need to ponder. My favorite online review of the book so far consists of one word, no. No, you can't be a Catholic and a feminist. Think purity culture, complementarity, gender identity, sexual orientation, women's exclusion from leadership roles, male God language, reproductive freedom, and so on. In the book, I focus on tensions around ethical issues, sex, marriage, work, abortion, and gender, because I'm an ethicist, and because for many people, I find it's these issues that are most important. They hit home. In some cases, I try to show that the tensions that used to be more significant are less so now due to developments in Catholic theology and feminism. So sex, marriage, and work fall in that category. Other issues like abortion, gender, power, and prayer, I see as hard cases. Here, I offer strategies for staying in the room or in the church, in the conversation, for living in the tension. Sandra Schneider's IHM, the first woman to teach at my school and author of many books, including a really important book on Catholic feminism, argued that the tension only deepens the longer one stays. She wrote, "Once she has begun the critical process of analysis, she will necessarily gradually be overwhelmed by the extent, depth, and the violence of the institutional church's rejection and oppression of women. This precipitates the inward crisis which the feminist Catholic inevitably faces, a deep, abiding, emotionally draining anger." That's a lot of tension. The Catholic tradition presents fundamental challenges to anyone who wants to be a Catholic and a feminist, and I try to help readers honestly reckon with that. Part 2. With depth comes recognition of common ground and potential synergy. Despite the powerful quote above, Sandra Schneider's didn't walk away from our school. She was a regular presence at our liturgies and those at the nearby Incarnation Monastery. For 40 years, longer than any other professor, she was here, and students flocked to her classes on the Gospel of John and Christian spirituality. How did she pull this off? Feminism and Catholicism, or at least strains of both, have a great deal in common and potential for even greater synergy when we put them together. Going deeper into feminist and Christian traditions can illuminate that. For instance, while some paint Catholics and feminists as at odds on marriage and family, with anti-family feminists on one side and patriarchal pro-marriage Catholics on the other, both traditions are more complicated. The Catholic tradition is complicated because Jesus' sayings about family don't fit easily into a pro-family box, and because the post-Vatican II Catholic tradition is mostly egalitarian. Most feminists have been what I call marriage reformers, who have long fought for equality on marriage and the same kinds of family-friendly work policies that Catholic social thought recommends. A Catholic feminist version of marriage as intimate and faithful, egalitarian, committed to the common good is more compelling than any other vision I know. As Sandra Schneider's told us, the more you know about Catholic theology and feminism, the worse the tension becomes. But the flip side is also true. Going deeper reveals more of the wisdom of both traditions and illuminates possibilities for more of what they could offer together. Point 3. Authentic belonging is possible. And yet, even with common ground and synergy, it is difficult to belong to a tradition when you see it as both graced and sinful, both prophetic and limited, both contributing to the healing of the world and contributing to structural sin. Belonging of all kinds has become more fraught today, as today we feel more responsible for what we belong to. We feel like we need to extricate ourselves from persons or groups that involve us in what we see as evil. Say like Amazon. But belonging is also more important than ever because, especially because of how it links us to others who are different from ourselves and opens us up to becoming better versions of ourselves. So how do feminists belong? What sustained Sandra Schneider's through 40 years of teaching in a school of theology of ministry, of teaching mostly men and men preparing for priesthood, given her deep, abiding anger? In an interview, Sandra told me that her vocation as a theologian was never a question. Once I discovered there was a job where you could think about God all day, she said, I never wanted to do anything else. What about teaching in a seminary? I've never had the sense that by belonging, I'm legislating something I don't believe in, she said. You'd have to leave the human race. If I only want to participate in something that meets all my standards, I'm going to become a lone ranger. Instead, she counseled me, find a way to be consistently undermining evil without undermining the project you believe in. Be a part of it, and at the same time, subvert it. She was proud of the significant project she had been a part of, and she continued to be critical of it. She found a way to belong. And so have many other Catholics. I've come to think that they do it by rejecting purity and embracing conscious belonging. To be sure, purity is attractive. The formerly Catholic singer-songwriter Audrey Assad seems to have had that kind of pure faith. She was a convert to Catholicism in 2007, and she became a favorite in Catholic circles, performing at universities and retreats and youth conferences. In 2021, when she announced she was no longer Catholic, her many fans were distraught. Assad didn't give a reason for her deconversion, but in an interview, she described awakening to the limitations she had previously accepted. She had grown frustrated with the Catholic Church, demanding ideological purity at all times in all situations. Asked what she did not miss about being Catholic, she said, "I can't be myself here," is how it felt. I don't miss that feeling of not being able to show up as my full, authentic self in a space because I'm afraid it would scandalize or offend. But what if there's another possibility, another way of belonging? With recognition of tensions and synergies between feminism and Catholicism, only a conscious belonging makes sense. Perhaps gay Catholics and Black Catholics model this for us. Padraig Ó Tuama, you may know him from NPR's On Being, is a gay poet and expert in conflict resolution in Northern Ireland. And he likes to say that belonging creates and undoes us. In spite of a long history of violent conflict, Protestants and Catholics in a peacemaking community he led are able to talk and pray together because they've decided they belong to each other. They've decided to let that belonging create and undo them. Theologian James Allison takes a similarly complicated stance of staying in the church for gay Catholics like himself. He doesn't shy away from calling out the difficulties, but he calls gay Catholics to love the project and help build the church they want to see. African-American Sister Thea Bowman is a wide guide for the kind of conscious belonging Catholic feminism seems to demand. Sister Thea was a convert to Catholicism, a teacher, a professor, a gifted singer. Though deeply conscious of racism in the Catholic tradition, she embodied joyful participation in the life of the church. In a fiery speech to the U.S. Catholic bishops in 1989, she urged her brother bishops to better accompaniment of Black Catholics. She spoke with urgency, humor, and love, naming the failures, the injustices, and neglect that had harmed Black Catholics while continuing her work in the church she loved. Feminist Catholics acknowledge the church's failings and its prophetic teachings, its flawed prayers, and its life-giving rituals, the damage its leaders have done, and its inspiring communion of saints. They choose to embrace conscious belonging. To be a Catholic feminist is to feel alienation, discomfort, along with joy in belonging to a church that offers an authentic way to be human, a wise and challenging balance of freedom and solidarity, a deep well of liturgy and communal prayer, and a constant call to deeper conversion. Purity is the gold standard for those who seek perfection and those who confidently walk out the door, leaving tradition behind. In contrast, like Sister Thea Bowman, Catholic feminists can belong even while continuing to feel pained by the church's failings and calling them out. With Sister Thea, with holy people who have always conscientiously challenged the church they love, I believe Catholic feminists can claim conscious belonging and show up as their authentic, broken, and beautiful selves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanlon Rubio. I really loved reading this book. It's really powerful. I think even your title, as you sort of hinted at, invites engagement. So I had the experience, fortunate or unfortunate, of reading the book on a plane. And so if you're sitting in the same aisle as me, you can see very clearly the question of the book. And so that invited all sorts of comments from my seatmates on answers to the question. But what I really appreciate is that your answer to the question is not a simple one at all. It's one that really sits in and explores that tension, and acknowledges it, and acknowledges that the question invites pain and joy at the same time. So I just really appreciated that. Tip, if you are reading the book and you don't want the men in your aisle to give you an answer to the question, you can very conveniently remove the dust jacket, which I figured out a little too late. So that was just really a rich discovery for me, that you're not just arguing that it's possible to be a Catholic and a feminist, but actually that both Catholicism and feminism are richer when they enliven and shape each other, and that people sit in that tension. And it made me feel, reading the book made me feel really excited about the possibility of Catholic women's spaces, and even institutions like St. Mary's College, where we're a Catholic women's institution, and to reflect on what creativity has brought about in these places and what it might be able to bring about. But you're also really clear in the book that there are real limits to what Catholic women can accomplish. So you talk about limitations to women's liturgical autonomy. You come out very clearly in the book against reserving priestly ordination for men alone. And I think I would add, from my experience at a Catholic women's institution, that Catholic women and leaders at Catholic women's institutions are constantly battling the temptations to internalize misogynistic self-limitation. We can be quick to hand over the work of Catholic mission to men or men's priorities. I'm curious, what role do you think internalized misogyny or internalized self-limiting scripts play in women's religious and spiritual identities?
Thank you, Julia. These are great questions. First, I just wanted to say I appreciate the affirmation of the complexity. I did struggle with my editor a little bit on this, because he was a little worried that it was too complicated. He's like, Julie, I need something simple that I can sell. But I'm like, I just can't give you that, because there is, I just don't see a simple answer, either a simple no or a simple yes. And I also recognized as I was writing that that I started grouping the different chapters into easier and harder cases, and realizing that my vision of what was easy and hard was inevitably going to differ from that of various readers, and that people were going to land in different places, and that not everyone was going to come to the same conclusions, and that was okay. Yeah, I heard Jenny Odell once talk about her book How to Do Nothing, less as an argument and more as a kind of a playground or a sandbox to play around in, and I came to think of the book somewhat more like that. So I appreciate that. Internalized misogyny is something that many Catholic women would say, what? Right? What are you talking about? Right? My experience of Catholicism has only been a source of strength, and I first want to honor that side and say, yeah. I mean, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and I know many of my fellow students and also women in Catholic universities have been empowered by these all-women Catholic spaces, and by women saints, and by Mary, and by awesome Catholic sisters, women religious. So and by their own, and by what they've been empowered to do. And yet, we can't deny that the possibility of internalized misogyny, especially the more we are conscious of it and reflect on it. So I think about the consciousness-raising groups in the 1970s of the feminist movement in the second wave in the United States. So some of the time women were coming there, and they were having their eyes opened to more of what they started to feel themselves but weren't sure about, and their consciousness was raised. And so, right, they saw more sexism than they saw before through this process. And similarly, we have to, when we become conscious, then we can start to see these things. So when we become conscious of things like the almost exclusive, not total, but almost exclusive use of male God language in the liturgy, when we become conscious that women are never interpreting the sacred text, leading the congregation in prayer, right? Serving as pastors, right? When we look around and see that all the women are silenced. This is particularly stark to me sitting in a school of theology and ministries, because I'm sitting next to my fellow professors, some of whom are, say, experts in scripture, right? Silent. Yeah. Right. What does that do to us and to our sense of what we can do? I think that's important to recognize. And, so clericalism is also something I've done work on. I think that works itself out with regard to lay people, all lay people, men and women. But yeah, women need to do some reflecting, right? And think about what we need to unpack and see and then address.
I think that can also, an area that also comes into play where consciousness raising can kind of seem to multiply problems very quickly, is another area that you're very well known for, talking about sex and reflecting on sexuality. And you write in the book that Catholics historically have not done a great job of talking about sexual violence as a sin. But it's precisely in some of these feminist consciousness raising settings that we can start to realize all of the ways in which sexual violence is written into the scripts of regular male-female encounters. You talk about this, that you really just didn't start thinking about that yourself until college. I probably was even later than that. I remember being in a class and thinking for the first time about that, and my mind was blown. But feminists have been talking about this for a long time and calling these scripts rape culture for decades. But Catholics have been kind of late to this conversation. So I'm curious, how can Catholics, and I know you've done a lot of thinking about this, how can Catholics enter into this conversation, even if they're late in the game? What gifts do they have to offer?
Yeah, it's really important. I'm actually working on a commentary on Gaudium et Spes right now, and one of the things that I'm noting, as did Feminist at the time, is that in the list of kind of acts that are opposed to human dignity, a famous passage in the document, sexual violence does not appear, right? And this is the middle of the 1960s, when certainly feminist consciousness about violence was on the rise. So we didn't pay attention to it for a long time. Really, it wasn't named until Francis. It's really a little bit with John Paul II, but more seriously with Francis, who really does talk about it and really name it as the major distortion of marriage when it exists in marriage, and then as a fundamental abuse of dignity. And this is so important. What do we have to do to be a player in that game, in that conversation? First, we obviously have to acknowledge the clergy sexual abuse that is our own sin in this game, in this area. We can't ignore that, and perhaps that the weight of that has in more recent decades kept the church from speaking out. I don't know. But we have to acknowledge that, and we have to be clear about how we're addressing it. And then we have to be clear about why sexual violence is wrong, and how it's wrong in and outside of marriage. The Catholic tradition hasn't had much to say about sexual ethics outside of marriage other than it's wrong. And that's kept us from paying attention to the kinds of abuses that happen in sex outside of marriage. But also, we have an over-idealized the understanding of marriage, which has made it hard to recognize the existence of sexual violence in marriage. Mm-hmm. So these things need to be unearthed. But I believe that we can call out sexual violence as an act against human dignity, as an injustice. I think feminist theologians like Megan McCabe, for instance, are super helpful to us in doing that work.
Another direction that I wanted to take, and you've been highlighting this, is that in your book, you make a lot of space for different types of Catholic feminists. So you make space for those who are very critical of traditional Catholicism. You also make space for those who would describe themselves as new Orthodox Catholic feminists. Why was this important to you, and what have you learned by doing this, by making this space?
Feminism is not just one thing, right? And neither is feminist theology. So I wanted to make sure that I gave a thick portrait of feminism as a movement with a range of thinkers in the book. certainly it wouldn't be the case that all types of feminism are compatible with Catholicism, right? And some types of feminism are less studied, especially maybe by people who are quick to dismiss feminism, right? We have one view of what it is. But then among Catholics, I'm very interested in different kinds of feminists. And I'm particularly interested in New Orthodox feminists, especially because they're younger. And frankly, they own the discourse right now. I believe that those who have the hashtag or the titles on Instagram and elsewhere, Catholic feminists, have more readers and followers than any Catholic feminist theologian has ever had, and they have a very different take on things. So in some ways, I say their take on Catholicism is perhaps less critical than I would encourage, but they are more empowered in many ways than I think previous generations of Catholic feminists have been. These are women who perhaps grew up as altar servers and leading retreats and giving talks and praying and doing things that maybe previous generations would not have done. And they're interesting. They are reclaiming some practices like the rosary, like adoration, that previous generations might have been a little bit worried about, but they're finding these practices to be empowering. So I want to be curious about all the different ways in which people bring these things together, and also inclusive of the diversity that we have in the church.
Thank you. Yeah, we have some really great questions from the audience, and I'd like to lift up that I think are meshing with this conversation, so I'll bring them in. One person is asking to hear more about the distinction between belonging and believing, or being and thinking that you're talking about. So what does it mean to belong by being, rather than, instead of belonging, just by agreeing with others? And if I can smush two of the questions together, if you might want to take that in the direction of thinking about some of the complexities, not just of belonging in a Catholic community, but also maybe belonging within a feminist community, given some of this diversity that you are naming, like how do those things go together? So you could take that any direction you want.
Yeah, that's a great question. Belief and belonging. And what does it mean to belong in general? So certainly belief is a part of belonging, but what felt new to me about the question now than the question as it was asked in the books I have on my shelves from the 80s and 90s is that this really has become more of a question of identity, and that makes it a question of belonging. There were a lot of people in the early years who said, my family is this, I've always been this, I can't not be this, and so I have to figure out how I can believe it or what to do if I don't believe all the things. But today, I don't think that holds. Just because my grandmother was the thing doesn't mean I'm going to be the thing. And I feel more responsible for what I say I am and what I belong to. So that question becomes more crucial. But what does it mean to belong? I do worry that sometimes we are too quick to extricate ourselves from all kinds of different relationships because we're worried about what the Catholic tradition calls cooperation with evil, or what we might more popularly see as contamination, or I just can't. I just can't. And sometimes that makes sense and that's important. And other times I wonder if we're too quick to cut those ties. And I would like more reflection on this conscious, complicated belonging. I'm a part of my family, even though I don't believe everything that they believe. I'm a part of a political party, even though they do things I disagree with. I am an American, and that's complicated right now. There aren't very many spaces in my life where belonging is not complicated. And so I can belong to this church too, but that doesn't mean, it should mean, so backing up, it should mean that I believe some really fundamental things. And I try in the concluding chapter of the book to say, these are the things that are really important, right? If you don't believe those things, it doesn't make sense. So believing is a part of this, right? But so is that participation that can be also critical and affirming. Mm-hmm. And that's part of it. And I think the contemporary Catholic tradition, certainly the contemporary Protestant traditions, make space for that kind of complicated belonging. But people often aren't taught that. So they're stuck with the purity script, meaning purity, pure belief. And so that means either I stay and there's one way to be, and if I can't be that, I leave, right? Much more complicated to stay and to belong, and it's complicated, right?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really most appreciated about the book, and I know I mentioned this a little bit before, but in your introduction, you are very clear about here are all of the things that Catholics and feminists agree on. And here are the things that there are some differences about. And the rest of the book is spent unpacking that. And so as you briefly spoke about, and I know you didn't get enough time to talk about, there are some places where that synergy is really fruitful, and the deeper that you get into a feminist analysis and the deeper that you get into the Catholic tradition, the more you see this meeting. And there are some places in which, the deeper that you get into thought and practice, and you discover tension. So that's just a shout out to say, read the whole book, because it's really great in outlining what are some of the places where that's done in an easier way, as you put it, and what are some of the easier spaces and what are some of the harder spaces in which we can reconcile different parts of our identity, maybe.
Right. Yeah. And if I could just add, I think it's important that my identity, and I would think any Catholic's identity as a feminist, is also complicated, right? So that there's also criticism and pain along with joy associated with being a feminist. And what I think is great about feminism is that there is space for that as well, right? And so one of the things I talk about in the book is how early feminism was in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was mostly a white movement, and those feminists had to eventually reckon with the whiteness of that movement, and they were called to task on that by Black feminists and womanist thinkers, and they had to change what they were doing and what they were saying and what they were writing about. And that critical dialogue happened within feminism. So I think that's both traditions are capacious enough to deal with complexity.
One of the very early on in your book, one of the most memorable ways that you do that for me is you you memorably label a kind of superficial feminism as a kind of eat, pray, love feminism, a kind of feminism that prioritizes absolute freedom above all else. And that stands in tension with maybe what you would also call, I don't know if this is appropriate to call it, a superficial kind of Catholicism that prizes self-sacrifice above everything else. And you argue that actually a deeper feminist analysis and a deeper familiarity with the Catholic tradition actually ends up holding freedom together with solidarity with other people. And so that's just an example of that. And it made me wonder as I was reading through the book, and here's my own question about that. I mean, is that a tension that you found yourself working through and talking through with your students and those who you mentor, especially as they navigate important life choices? I almost could imagine you rehearsing some of that as you walk alongside of those who you teach.
Mm. I feel like the Eat, Pray, Love feminism is one of the more controversial parts of the book, because I know people love that book. But it did strike me as a feminist spirituality book, maybe the best-selling feminist spirituality classic of our times or ever. And it resonates, and there are important things about it, and yet it's ultimately thin. It's a thin kind of feminism that is pretty individualistic and doesn't have much room for commitment or solidarity. And then, on the other side is this kind of vision of Catholic womanhood as all sacrificial that still exists in some circles, not everywhere, but it still does exist in some circles, and also can be actually not a full vision of our tradition, right? Too narrow, too gendered, too much focus on self-sacrifice, not acknowledging what the tradition has to say about freedom and self-development. Right. So these are, I wanted to kind of lay those out as poles, right? So that people could see, okay, this is not what we're going for here, and they're out there, and they can be popular, right? They can pull people, they can be attractive, but there are more complicated versions. And one of the theologians who plays the strong role in the book is Sean Copeland from Boston College, and they're theologians who are feminists, who are really holding together that the necessity of freedom, right? That's the good part of Eat, Pray, Love, right? And self-development with a commitment to solidarity that requires self-reflection and self-criticism and self-giving. It's not that feminist theologians only focus on the freedom. They don't. And there also are really good feminist thinkers who are trying to hold together those same things. So we can do better than Eat, Pray, Love and super sacrificial Catholic feminism. But it's just that most people don't know, they don't care about those versions of being Catholic. And I wanted to bring those to their attention. It's harder. It's just harder. You know, sometimes you read a Margaret Farley or a Sean Copeland, like, well, what is she saying? Which one is it? Both, right? Both. But those are the thinkers I find most adequate for really thinking about what it is to live a moral life. Yeah.
Someone from the audience mentioned posed a question to go back to Sandra Schneider. So maybe one of those theologians who does such a great job of talking about the complexity of Catholic spirituality. She said that she never had qualms about being a theologian, maybe even as she felt some of the tensions of being Catholic and being a feminist. And so this person asks, could the discipline of theology help us to navigate this tension in a particular way? Is there something about being invited into that kind of a community that has helped you or can help others to navigate these tensions?
Absolutely. So you don't have to be a theologian to be a Catholic and a feminist, for sure. But I can say for certain that I would not be a Catholic feminist and I would not be Catholic without theology. And theology is just essential. So I know that there are people for whom it doesn't play a role, and there are other things about Catholicism and its practice and their family or whatever it is that are compelling enough for them. But for me, and I think this is true for more and more people, once you start seeing these problems, right? These are intellectual problems. And they simply can't be answered without a depth of knowledge. But theology is where we've been doing that kind of thinking, right? Where we've been talking about faith and reason and wrestling with questions and asking all kinds, right? So some of my friends have been like, can you be a feminist and a Calvinist? Can you be a feminist in this? And, or can you be a Christian and a capitalist? Can you be a Christian? Theologians have been wrestling with tensions in belief systems and identities for a long time and have tools. I think everyone has theological questions, right? We're both mothers. We know this, right? Even the littlest humans have theological questions, and but they don't get to read good theology. But to be invited into reading theology, talking about theology, writing theology, is to be able to wrestle with the complexity of these questions.
Thank you. Yeah. To change topics a little bit, I was really excited to hear that your book was recently translated into Italian. And you also just spent the last semester in El Salvador. So I'm thinking about how your work and your ideas have been received in international contexts, and maybe how these international contexts have shaped your thinking. Do you have any thoughts about that? I know you just came back, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I was really surprised. My work hasn't been translated to other languages, so I was just really moved when an Italian writer reached out to me about this. And of course, I haven't read the book in Italian, but I have read the introduction translated. And it seems to me that what resonated is exactly this complexity that we've been talking about. And it seemed that there wasn't something similar in Italian theology. There aren't as many women who are theologians, right? But certainly the Catholicism, people are struggling to be Catholic in Europe, of course, and are in need of something like this. So I was moved by that. I really hope that the book will eventually be translated into Spanish. My time in El Salvador convinced me even more of the need for that. I think that the suffering of women in many Latin American countries is something that needs to be reckoned, as well as its connection to aspects of Christian faith needs to be reckoned with. The extent of sexual and physical violence, of infidelity in marriage, of just abandonment of women and children have left a lot of women with not much hope for men and for their faith. Sometimes their faith is still with them as a source of strength. But there are ways in which a feminist theological analysis could be really important. I was lucky to be a visiting professor at the UCA in the University of Central America, and there are some people there on faculty working on feminist theology, and they're very aware of how very practical their work is. I just can't stress enough. I think in the U.S. we are in a different place, but in other parts of the world we are not, and their feminist theology is even more crucial. And so this was driven home to me by my time in El Salvador. It's also true that in base communities, without maybe advanced theological study, women and men are moving ahead in really interesting and empowering ways. My former SLU student, now Professor Laurel Marsh, has done outstanding work on that. So sometimes these ideas and practices come from the base, and can be reflected on by us, but also there's a huge need for theology.
Mm-hmm. You might have already started this, but can you tell us a little bit about your next writing project, Family Repair?
Yeah, I'm really excited for this project. So it comes out of a worry about how many people are feeling alienated from or not talking to members of their families. So especially, you might have seen news stories of adult children cutting off their parents. And also always there are stories around Thanksgiving, I think, about what are you going to do when you have to go home and talk to that uncle or whatever. But it is something I've found that affects at least 25% of families in the US and Europe. And yet we really don't pay attention to it in ethics. So I wanted to look at theology and practices of reconciliation and restorative justice, which really are never applied to families, and see if they had any wisdom for us there. So for what I'm calling repair. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'm wondering if I could ask you one final question that might be putting you on the spot a little bit. I know your book came out in 2024, but since your book has been published, we've started a somewhat new chapter in the Catholic Church. So I'm curious if you had any hopes for Pope Leo's papacy and some of the tensions that you name in this book. And that's just begun, so I know that's why I'm saying it might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but I'm curious if you had any reflections on that.
I feel confident that Pope Leo is continuing Pope Francis's legacy, especially with regard to dialogue and synodality. Those are the tools we have right now to move forward, and I think those are important. Francis also did a lot of work kind of behind the scenes to put women in places where there were no rules for them that they couldn't serve, but they weren't serving. And that has begun to change things in Rome and elsewhere. I hope that will continue. The fact that Pope Leo was educated in a school like mine is where there are also lay women and men also gives me hope that he will see possibilities for women in the church. With that said, I hope for progress on the issue of women deacons. I don't know if that will come or not. And I don't imagine that, say, 20 years from now, if Pope Leo is no longer Pope, I don't imagine that we will be in a radically different place. That is, I don't imagine that the tensions that animate the question of the book will go away anytime soon.
Well, thank you so much for first of all, thank you for a wonderful book. And thank you for a really wonderful conversation tonight. I really recommend the book to everyone who's listening. And I really appreciate your generous engagement tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.